Good afternoon, my ECO 2301 students. I've been watching your exam 2 results trickling on Canvas. They look pretty good. I see a lot of good performance there. So that kind of reassures me as a professor that you guys are understanding the material very well. So remember, the material that you had for your midterm 2, which covers up to chapter 17, I would say chapter 1 through 17 that we have covered through this class are all microeconomic chapters. So today we're going to switch gear and we'll start talking about macroeconomic topics. Microeconomics, as I said, because this class combines both microeconomics and macroeconomics. Microeconomics, as we said at the beginning, is the study of individual units in the economy, such as consumer behavior, farm behavior, how farms maximize profit, like we have been talking about different market structures, like oligopoly, monopolistic competition, perfect competitive markets, and then supply and demand, the concept of elasticity and stuff like that. So today we're going to start talking about topics that affect the entire economy as a whole. That's what we call macroeconomics. So macroeconomics is a study of the economy as a whole. So the topics that we're going to be covering are topics that will affect the entire economy, not just one firm, not just one consumer or a group of consumers. It has to affect the entire economy. So you probably have heard about topics such as GDP. That's actually what we're going to be talking about today, or topics such as unemployment. So let's start talking about how macroeconomists or economists measure the total value of production in the economy. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen, then we're going to talk about it on the other side. So this is chapter 26, which is GDP and the measurement of progress. So GDP, as the name suggests, that stands for gross domestic product. Okay, so let me open my slide here again. I kind of write the definition in full. So as I said, GDP stands for gross domestic product. So the definition of GDP, as we're going to later see, so the goal of this chapter, we want to show you how to measure GDP. But the first thing we want to do, we want to define what it is. Okay, we want to define the animal in the room. So GDP is going to measure the total market values of all final goods and services, or finished goods and services, depending on what you want to call it, how you want to call it. So it's the total market value of all finished goods or final goods that are produced within the country's border in a given time period, regardless of who is producing it or regardless of nationality. As long as those goods and services, finished goods, when I talk about finished goods, these are goods that are what? Ready for use by the end user. Goods that are used to be sold, that are sold to the consumers for final use. Okay? So they have to be finished goods. So let me say that again. GDP is going to measure the market value of all final goods and services produced in a country in a given time period, typically 1 year. So if we are economists, if we are measuring the GDP of the United States for 2024, for example, we are summing up all the value of all final goods and services produced in America and only in 2024. Okay, we cannot sum the values of goods that were produced in America in 2023 because they were already counted in 2023 GDP. Because GDP just measures the value of production in 1 year, not in different years. Okay? So the goods, whether the goods were produced in 2023 and they were not sold or they were sold in 2024, they are not going to count as 2024 GDP. Because whether the good was produced and sold in 2023 or not, their values were already counted in 2023 GDP. So we cannot again repeat counting the values of those same goods that we counted in 2023 in 2024 GDP. Okay? So let me share my outline of this chapter. You can see the outline there. We're going to define what GDP is, which I already did for the most part. And then I'm going to also show you always people talking about that how is the economy growing? Oh, that the US economy has grown by 2-3%. So I'm going to show you guys how to calculate the growth rate. Okay, let's say the economy between 2023 to 2024, somebody might say, oh, the US economy has grew by 3%. How did that arrive at that 3% number? We're going to show you. And then we're also going to talk about these two related concepts, the distinction between nominal GDP versus real GDP. And then we shall talk about cyclical and short-run changes in GDP. And then, of course, I'm going to talk you away with the many ways of splitting GDP, or the many ways that economies, measure GDP. How do we calculate or measure GDP? And then we shall talk about problems with GDP as a measure of output and as a measure of welfare, and some key takeaways. Because the key presumption is that if the economy is producing a lot of output GDP, the economy, that means that the welfare of that country is going to be good, because people will have jobs, they're going to be whatever. But we're going to be talking about that there's some limitation of using GDP numbers as a measure of welfare or measure of well-being. Okay. For example, I'm going to tell you of my back of the back. Even though the United States is the largest economy in the world, so the size of the economy is measured by GDP, by how much the economy is producing. And America by far is the largest economy in the world, followed by China. China is the second largest economy after the United States. Okay. So even if a country is producing a lot of output, there could be some things that might not be captured, which could impact a country's well-being. One example is that GDP does not account for crime. So a country may be producing a lot of GDP, but we may have very high crime rates across our cities. GDP also does not account for leisure. We know leisure activity is one of the things that affect our welfare. Maybe Americans are producing a lot of output and they barely even have time to sleep or walk their dog in the park. They don't have time for leisure activities. So GDP does not account for leisure. So we'll talk about that as we reach that point. Okay. So real GDP per capita is a rough measure of the country's standard of living. Okay. And I'm just going to write the formula right away. So standard of living, when somebody say that we like to compare standard of living across countries. So the key idea is that a country with a real GDP per capita, which is highest of all, that country would be having the highest standard of living. So standard of living is measured by real GDP per capita. Real GDP per capita, you can also call it per person. Per capita is the same thing as per person. So that means we are basically looking at the average income in a country. So the formula basically is going to be pretty straightforward. I want to write right away that real GDP per capita, which is a measure of living standard, real GDP per capita, which again I said is a measure of the standard of living. You take real GDP divided by the country's population, because you want to see on average how much is every American earning in a year on average. Like for the United States, our real GDP per capita is about $70,000. But that doesn't, I'm not suggesting that every American earns $70,000. This is just an average number. Of course, some Americans don't earn anything. And then a lot of times, very few Americans earn most of what we have. Like wealth is concentrated among the top 5% wealthiest Americans, the billionaires in this country and millionaires. So this is not accounting for income disparity or income inequality. It's just giving us an average number that if we calculate, if we have the total value of all final goods and services, if we divide that by the population, that gives you an average number, how much an average American on average earns. So for the United States, this is roughly what? Is approximately $70,000. In India, India has made a lot of progress. It's approximately $7,000. So let's look at the numbers. So for example, between 2000 and 2010, India is one of the fastest growing developing economies out there. and China, of course. So between 2000 and 2010, just within 10-year period, the average income in India was averaging what? 7% per year, and it doubled. So this growth led to a doubling of the standard of living. In other words, the real GDP per capita, or the average income in India between 2000 and 2010 doubled from about $3,500 per person to $7,000. You can see the graph down here. You can see clearly India was quite poor in income per capita stayed flat for most of the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, okay? And then it started increasing rapidly in the 90s. But if you look at just between 2000, that I'm telling you, 2000 is here. You see the per capita income is about three, kind of like whatever. But now it jumped to what? Close to 7,000. So that means income in the average income in India doubled between 2000 and 2010. So in this chapter, we will explain what GDP means and how it's measured. We're also going to talk about the difference between the level of GDP and the growth rate of GDP. Okay? And then I'm going to show you the difference between nominal GDP and real GDP, and how growth in per capita real GDP is, is a standard measure of economic progress. So the use of GDP in business cycle measurement, we'll talk about that. Then, of course, the problem with GDP as a measure of output and welfare. So as we defined earlier, gross domestic product, or GDP, is a market value. See, look at me, look at the keywords. The market value of all finished goods and services produced within a country in a year. So I wanted you to follow the keywords. In America, maybe you could think about then in America, how many different types of finished goods get produced in a year? Maybe millions and millions of different types of what? Finished goods. Produced ranging from light bulbs, from cars, computers, projectors, so many things. New housing. Services could include haircuts, transportation services, healthcare services, insurance. So there are different types of services out there too. Services are the intangible things that you may not see with your bare eyes. Okay? So as I said, GDP per capita or GDP per person, you take GDP divided by the population. So if you're talking about real GDP, is per capita is real GDP divided by population. So an economist's total output includes millions of different goods and services. As I said, in America, we produce millions of different types of goods. So the challenge is, how do we quantify the different types of goods that we produce? Keep in mind that some goods are more valuable than others. Cars are more valuable than what? Like packs of gums that we're producing. So to arrive at the GDP numbers, we have to go by the market value. So we're going to say, if the United States produced, like, say, 1 billion cars in 2024, and let's say on average, each car costs $30,000. The price of each car is $30,000. Then the market value of cars produced would be 1 billion cars produced times 30,000, because each car is $30,000. And then we are going to add that across all goods. If we produce maybe, say, 1.5 billion projectiles, and each projector is about $2,000. We multiplied 1.5 billion projectiles times what? Times 2,000. And sum that across all goods. If the country produced maybe 2 billion computers, brand new laptops or computers, if each computer is priced at $900, we multiply 900 times the quantity produced. And then we do that for each good, final good, finished good that we are producing in the country, and sum that across all goods. That's what GDP is. Okay? So GDP uses market value. We cannot add cars to just the number of cars to the number of what? Computers produced. It's like adding oranges and apples. We need to get the market value in dollars of each product that is produced in a given year. Okay, then sum that are all across all finished goods. Okay. So we're also going to define some concepts like intermediate goods. Intermediate goods are goods that have not reached their final stages of production. These goods are sold to firms and then bundled or processed with other goods or services for sale at a later stage. I want to give you one example. In the production of a car, we know that 70% of the car is made out of steel. Okay? So that means if we think of steel as the key component or the key raw material good for making cars, steel itself is not a final good. Steel is an intermediate good, okay, which is supplied to, say, auto companies like GM, Ford, Chrysler, Tesla, and then they're going to use it to what? To make the car. The car is a final good. It's a finished good because a consumer can buy the car for use. But the steel is not. In fact, if you look at the production of every good in America or anywhere, it goes through several stages of production. So if about 70% of the car is made out of steel, where does steel come from itself? So someone mine as raw aluminum. A mining company is going to mine raw aluminum. And then the mining company, after mining raw aluminum, they're going to supply that raw aluminum to the steel plant. And the steel plant is going to transform raw aluminum into steel. But steel is not a final good either. And then after the steel company has steel plant has transformed raw aluminum into steel, they're going to supply steel to the what? To the auto industry, to the auto companies. And the auto companies are going to use steel to make the car. After all, we said about 70% of the car is made out of steel. So those are the stages of which the production of a car will go through. The car is a finished good. Steel and aluminum are not. So in calculating GDP, we do not add the value of intermediate goods. Goods that are not reached their finished what? Stages of production or final stages of production. We will sum the values of cars because cars are finished products. But we cannot just sum the value of aluminum. You cannot sum the value of aluminum produced in 2024 and then again sum the values of cars you have used this aluminum to produce those cars. You'll be doing what we call double counting. Okay? You're adding the value of something twice or sometimes even 3 times. To avoid that, we just compute, economists, we compute the value of the finished good. We don't compute the value of intermediate goods. Okay? So finished goods are sold to final user, then consumed or held in personal inventories. So to avoid double counting, only finished goods are included in the calculation of GDP. However, machinery and equipment used to produce other goods are included in GDP. When you're talking about machineries, like tractors, like whatever we use on stuff like that. And other equipment that are out there. So let's test your understanding of this. Which of the following is a finished good? A book in Amazon's inventory. That is not a finished good. Okay? Tires purchased by Toyota plant. That is an intermediate good because Toyota as a plant, when they buy tires, they're going to put it on a car. So that's an immediate good. But if you buy tires for yourself, tires purchased by you for your car, then that is a what? A finished good. So the correct answer here is C. Tires purchased by you are finished good because they are for your own use consumption, not for resale. Okay? Because Toyota as a plant, if they purchase tires, they're going to put them on their new cars. Or the used cars, if they're selling used cars, then they will resell the car to the consumer. That's why tires purchased by Toyota as a plant will not count as GDP, but tires purchased by you as an individual is a finished good. So let's look at the output of an economy includes both goods and services. When we're measuring GDP or output of an producing economy, it includes both what? Both goods and services. Goods are the tangible things that you can see with your bare eyes, like cars, like computers. Services are going to be things like transportation, medical care, haircuts. These are examples of services. So since 1950, the service industry has increased a lot, from less than 50% of US GDP to almost 70% of GDP in contemporary times. So the US economy is more of a it's more of a service-based economy. And that makes a lot of sense. If you go back in history, let's say you go back 400 years ago, the farm sector used to be very significant, the agricultural sector. But the economy of the United States went through what we call structural transformation. That we move away from agriculture. That doesn't mean there's no agriculture. There's agriculture, but the share of agriculture in national output got smaller and smaller. Why? Because we went to industries, industrialization, manufacturers. So manufacturers started to dominate our GDP until around the 1970s, 1980s, when the globalization began. So globalization is the idea that American companies started to shut down their production plants here and relocating their production plants overseas. Okay, most companies going overseas to China, India, Indonesia, South Africa, and elsewhere, they're looking for cheap labor. That's the reason why they relocate overseas in the first place. So that means once globalization started, American companies started to relocate their production plants overseas, manufacturing or industries also became an important component of GDP, meaning that the share of manufacturers in national output declined with globalization. Then the economy transitioned from industry or manufacturers to services. So if you mark my word, and by the way, in the development of an economy, economists expect that such structural transformation to take place through those three phases. You go from agriculture or like maybe country that's producing just pure raw material goods like agricultural goods, mining and stuff like that, to industries, industrialization and manufacturers. And then from there, then you go to service in the service sector dominates. So that has been the process for structural transformation taking place in the US economy, maybe over 400 years. Okay. Okay. So GDP measures production. So sales of things like all houses, used goods, and financial assets are not added to GDP. The GDP is measuring production. So if you buy stocks on Amazon stocks, that doesn't count as GDP. We don't include stocks or bonds or cryptocurrencies as part of GDP. Okay, the stock market is not part of the economy, real economy. I always say, people confuse this, and I know some of you are going to say, some people think that when the stock market is doing well, the real economy is doing well as well. That is not necessarily true. There's a disconnect between the real economy and the stock market. Okay. All right. So, and then sales of all houses. If you buy a house that was built in 1999 or 2005, you bought it in 2024, that is not going to be included in 2024 GDP because the value of that house was already counted in 2005 when it was first built. If you buy a used Toyota Tundra from a Toyota dealership, may say 2023 Toyota Tundra, you bought it in 2024. The value, the purchase of that Toyota Tundra in 2024 will not count towards 2024 GDP. I made that very clear. Because the value of that Toyota was already counted as 2023 GDP when it was produced. Okay? When we're measuring GDP, we only count the values, market values of new goods, which are goods and services produced in that particular year. So 2024 GDP only includes the market value of all finished goods and services produced in 2024. Used goods are not part of it. And of course, financial assets such as stocks, bonds, cryptocurrencies are not part of GDP either. I talked about that. So the United States GDP includes goods and services produced by labor and capital located in the United States, regardless of the nationality of the workers or property owners. What do I mean by that? So I talked about this in the definition earlier. GDP measures the market value of all finished goods and services produced within the United States or within a country in a given time period, regardless of the nationality of who is producing that good. Whether those goods are produced by Chinese companies, Italian companies, American companies, Mexican companies, as long as those companies are producing inside the United States, the value of their production is better be called GDP. Let me repeat that again. GDP measures the market value of all final goods and services produced within a country's border, regardless of nationality or regardless of who produces it there. Whether those goods are produced by American companies or American nationals, residents, or they are produced by Italian companies which are producing in the United States or Mexico. Their key idea is they must be produced within the United States. Okay? Then they qualify to be GDP of the United States. So if an American citizen or American company produces goods in China, and those goods are sold back to the United States, those do not count as US GDP. It will count as a second measure, GNP. I'm going to talk about GNP. See, GNP stands for Gross National Product. GDP does not care who produces those goods. As long as those goods are produced in America, they better be called US GDP. If an American company relocates production to China or India and they produce in India, the value of what they're producing in India is going to count as India's GDP, not US GDP. Okay. Now, this takes me to the second definition, another way so some economists or some people are a little bit conservative. They want to know what our own is producing, what American nationals or American citizens or permanent residents are producing. So if we add the market value of all final goods and services produced by only American nationals or American companies, regardless of where they're producing those goods, then that enters under GNP. So again, GNP, we don't care where the goods are produced, but they must be produced by American companies or American nationals. Then they what? They are going to be called GNP. GDP, we don't care who is producing those goods. It can be produced by nationals and non-nationals. As long as those goods are produced within the United States, they better be called GDP. So that's just the contrast between the two measures of production. But when you look at the numbers, the GDP and GNP numbers, the numbers are always very small. The difference is very small between GNP and GDP. So gross national product, again, is the market value of all finished goods and services produced by a country's permanent residents. What I mean, nationals of a country, wherever they are located within a year. Whether those American nationals or residents are producing in Germany, in the United States itself, in China, we're going to track down the values of all final goods and services produced by only American residents or permanent nationals of this country. Then that is going to go under GNP. So here's so gross national product, that's the definition I just provided. So national wealth refers to the values of a nation's entire stock of assets. So when we're talking about national wealth, the wealth of the United States, we are talking about the accumulated stock of assets of America. GDP tells us only how much the nation produced in one single year, not how much it has accumulated in its entire history. No. How much you have accumulated in your entire history is your wealth. But how much you're producing in just one single year is GDP. So GDP, who calculates GDP? GDP is calculated every year by a branch, part of the Commerce Department called the Bureau of Economic Analysis. It's a federal bureau. And you can go and check their website The website is of this Federal Bureau, www.bea.gov, Bureau of Economic Analysis.gov. During your free time, you can go and check statistics or US GDP. You can go back to 1912 to even 1800. The numbers are there to contemporary times. So the Bureau of Economic Analysis, again, is a government agency or the federal part of the Commerce Department that is in charge calculating GDP and releasing it to Americans. Okay? And GDP is calculated quarterly and annually. So we track the number, how much we're producing in a quarter every 3 months. And then we dump the all for all the year. We compute, we now add all the 4 quarters in a year to get the annual GDP. So GDP can be calculated quarterly or annually. So now let's talk about growth rates. When somebody asks you that, oh, when you hear somebody say, oh, the economy has been growing at 3-4%, what do we mean by that? So for example, we want to see how the economy grew between 27. The growth rate is a percentage change in GDP from one period to the next. And you guys know how to calculate the percentage change. If somebody tells you that if you went to the mall today and the price on a dress was $100, and you go back tomorrow and the price on the same dress has jumped to $120, and somebody asks you to calculate the percentage change in the price of a dress, the percentage change in the price of a dress is the same thing as a growth rate in the price of the dress. So what you do, you're going to take the price of the dress tomorrow minus the price of the dress today divided by the price of the dress today and then multiply by 100. So likewise, to calculate GDP for the United States between 2017 and 2018, how much the economy has grown, you're going to take the GDP in 2018, subtract from it GDP of a year prior to 2018, which is 2017, divided by GDP of 2017, then multiply by 100. So it's just a percentage change in GDP from one period to the next. So these are actual numbers, by the way. So the US GDP for 2018 was about $20.6 trillion. These numbers are in billions of dollars. Remember, there are 1,000 billions in a trillion. So when I say 20,580 billion, that's the same thing as saying about $20.6 trillion. And then 19,519 what? $billion in 2017, that's the same thing as $19.6 trillion. Rounded to the what? To the next place of decimal. So if I'm to calculate the growth rate of GDP between 2018 and 2017, you take the GDP for 2018, which is $20.6 trillion, minus the GDP of 2017, which is $19.6 trillion, divided by the GDP of 2017, which is $19.6 trillion. Then you multiply by 100. So number is 5.4%. So the idea is that the economy of the United between 2017 and 2018, the economy expanded by 5.4%, or it has grown, it grew by 5.4%. Very simple formula. If I ask you to calculate if GDP in 1990 was $5,803 billion, which is about $5.8 trillion, and GDP in 1991 was about $6 trillion, 5,995 billion, that's about $6 trillion. And then somebody asks you, what was the growth rate of GDP between those two time periods? So you're going to take growth rate in GDP equals to, you take GDP in 1991 minus GDP of 1990. Okay. And then you divide this by GDP 1990. And then all these, you're going to multiply by 100 because it has to be in percentage. Okay. So the answer is going to be C, 3.31%. So is that right there? The growth rate is going to be, that is a GDP of 1991 minus a GDP of 1990, close bracket, divide by GDP of 1990, all big bracket times 100, which is 3.31%. Very simple. Now, let's talk about a related topic here. There's going to be a distinction between nominal GDP and real GDP. Okay? So, because when you think about it, GDP is supposed to measure the productive capability of a country, how much the economy is producing. Okay? The problem with that, because we're only using market values, the numbers that we can calculate if you're using just market values in every year could be misleading in the sense that the economy may not make progress actually productively, but prices may rise on goods and services, giving us an illusion that the economy has made progress productively. Because certainly, if you're multiplying the quantities of goods produced with an increasing price, it's going to give you a higher value. So to control for changes in prices, or what we call inflation, economists are going to calculate two numbers. We're going to calculate what we call nominal GDP. So nominal GDP is going to be calculated using prices at the time of sale. So, or you can say nominal GDP is GDP at current year prices. So if I'm calculating GDP for 2018, I'm going to use the prices of goods in 2018. So in other words, nominal GDP does not account for inflation or rising prices. And it can be misleading because it could basically portray that the economy has made progress productively, and yet what is driving those numbers could be inflation, could be rising prices, not the economy producing many different types of goods, increasing the actual quantity. Okay? So to control for inflationary pressures, we are going to calculate another statistic, which we're going to be calling real GDP. Okay? First of all, nominal variables are variables such as nominal GDP that have not been adjusted for changes in prices. That's what I'm saying. So to control for that, we're going to calculate another measure called real GDP. So, but let's talk about, so to remove the effect of price changes, we calculate GDP in constant prices. So let's look at the distinction here. So nominal GDP for 2018, as I said, you take the price in 2018 in that particular year and multiply by the quantities of goods and sum that across goods. For example, if the economy had produced only, we know the economy produces a million different types of goods. Let me open my slide here to show you guys kind of like just a simple example. So that you see, appreciate what I'm talking about here. Let's pretend that in 2018, the economy has produced only two types of goods. Just a simple example. We know that the economy produces million different types of goods and services. But for our own sake of understanding, we're assuming that for our sake, let's assume that the economy only produced only two different types of goods. The economy produced cars, and let's just assume only 10 cars. Just a simple number. And also produced 10 what? Computers. And let's say the price of a car in 2018 was $20,000. Let's just pretend. And the price of a computer in 2018 was, let's say, $800. Now, if I ask you to calculate the nominal GDP for 2018, you are going to take the price of a car produced in 2018 times the quantity of cars produced in 2018. So this is 2018 price multiplied by 2018 quantity. Then you add to it the price of computers in 2018 multiplied by quantity of computers in 2018. That's it. which in this simple example, your nominal GDP would be the price of a car in 2018 is $20,000. So you multiply $20,000 by the quantity produced in 2018, which is 10 cars. Then you add to it the price of computers in 2018, which is what? $800. Multiplied by the quantity of computers produced in 2018, which is what? 10. So 20,000 times 10, that is 200,000 plus 800 times 10, that's 8,000. So that means nominal GDP for 2018, it is in this simple example would be just $208,000. It's very simple. Keep it simple. That's how we calculate nominal GDP. So when you're calculating nominal GDP, you're going to use the prices of goods in that particular year. The problem, as I said, with this measure is that what about if we are tracking this number across period, across time? Let's say we're calculating nominal GDP for 2017, 2016, 2015, okay? So if I calculate nominal GDP for 2015, I'm going to use the price of those computers in 2015 times the quantity of computers in 2015 plus the price of a car in 2015, like that. And then the same thing for 2016. The problem with that, if prices continue to rise and the quantity does not change that much, nominal GDP is going to be misleading to us that it would send a signal as if the economy has made progress productively. And yet what is driving those numbers could just be rising prices or inflation. So to control for that, economists calculate a second measure of GDP, which we call real GDP. Real GDP is we're gonna keep prices constant. So we're gonna make a selection of what we call a base year price. And the choice of a base year by the Bureau of Economic Analysis sometimes is arbitrary, but most of the time the Bureau is gonna select a year where they believe prices are relatively stable. Let's do one example here. I'm going to give you some numbers on the whatever. So let's say, let's just pretend. Let's say in 2022, the economy produced two types of goods. We produce 10, let's just be a username. Let's say we produce 20 cars and we produce 10 computers. Okay. And then the price of a car in 2022, let's say it was $20,000. And the price of a computer in 2022, let's say it was $1,000. Let's just pretend. And then let's say in 2023, okay, the economy produced what? Let's say 25 cars. So the price of a car, and then any other produced, say, 15 computers. But let's assume that the price of a car, because we have been having inflation last year and this year, cars have become very, very expensive. The price of a car jumped to $25,000 from $20,000 in 2023. And the price of a computer jumped to what? $1,500. Okay, now let's assume that 2022 is the base year period. So the question could come then, I want you to calculate, let's do this example, it's going to be fun. Let's say, calculate Roman 1, nominal GDP in 2022 and 2023. And then Roman 2, calculate real GDP in 2022 and 2023. Okay, so That's going to be easy. So let's do that. So the idea is that so I'm gonna start with, so say Roman 1. Nominal GDP in 2022. You take the price of cars in that particular year. You multiply that by the quantity of cars, Q stands for quantity, in the same year. And then you add to it price of computers, price of a computer in 2022 times the quantity of computers produced in 2022. That's right. That's how you calculate nominal GDP for 2022. So in this case, your nominal GDP is going to be the price of a car we have been in 2022, we have been told was what? Was $20,000. You multiply that by the quantity of cars produced in 2022. Our example said there were 20 cars. See that? So you're multiplying that by 20. And then you add to it the price of a computer in 2022. We were told it was $1,000, remember? Multiplied by the quantity of computers produced in 2022, which was what? Forgot what it was. It was in 2022, how many computers did we produce? 10 computers. Multiplied by 10. So that means nominal GDP, which my notation or the short form or acronym is going to be nominal, and GDP is nominal GDP for 2022 is going to be 20,000 times 20, that is 400,000. 1,000 times 10, that's 10,000. So this is going to be $410,000. And you sum this and that. Okay? And then we have also been told to calculate nominal GDP in 2023. So nominal GDP in 2023, you're going to take the price of cars in 2023. You multiply that by the quantity of cars in the same year, 2023. And then you're going to add to it the price of a computer in 2023 plus times what? The quantity of computers produced in 2023. Very simple. So you use that same particular year's quantity and price. So that means nominal GDP in 2023 is going to be, we have been told that the price of a computer in the problem was what? In 2023 was jumped to what? $25,000. So it's $25,000 instead of $20,000 in 2023 is now more expensive. And we have been told that we produce 25 of them. 25 cars. Plus the price of a computer in 2023 is 1,500. And the quantity of computers produced in 2023 was what? 15. So that means that's going to be 1,500 times 15. So if you sum that up, okay, so 25,000 times 25, that's going to be $625,000. Plus, I want to make sure we didn't make a mistake here. So we're going to add that to the value of computers, which is going to be 1,500 price of a computer times the number of computers produced. So that's going to be 22,500 here. So if you sum them together, 625, you're going to find that nominal GDP in 2023 is going to be $647,500. But now, if we compare those two periods, think about it for a second. This economy did not make a lot of progress significantly to almost make GDP double in value. Because you can see clearly in 2023, nominal GDP was 410,000. We produced 20 cars in 2022. And in 2023, we only increased by 5 cars to 25 cars. Computers jumped from 10 to 15. So it's not a lot of production increase. But yet, now nominal GDP is almost double. It's 647,500 from 410,000. So what could be driving this number could be prices have become, these goods have become more expensive. Okay, so now to account for that price level change, we are going to calculate another measure, which is going to be called real GDP. So real GDP is calculated using a base year price. So let me write that very clear. So real GDP is calculated using what we call using a base year price. The word base year, you can also say call it constant. All price is constant. So because 2022 has been designated as a base year period, if I ask you to calculate the real GDP for 2022, that's going to be the same thing as nominal GDP in 2022. You're going to take the quantity of cars produced in 2022 multiplied by the base year price. The base year price also happens to be 2022. And then you're going to add to it the quantity of cars produced in computers produced in 2022 times the price in the base year period. So it turns out that if you have already calculated the nominal GDP for a base year period, we already calculated nominal GDP was $410,000. You don't need to calculate real GDP for the base year period. Nominal GDP and real GDP are always the same in the base year period. You're going to get the same thing, $410,000. But not real GDP in any other period, which is not a base year period like 2023, will not be the same as nominal GDP in that year. So in this case, you don't have to waste time. I'm going to write here that except for the base year period, real GDP and nominal GDP are different. The word is except for the base year period, meaning that during the base year period, nominal GDP and real GDP are the same. But any other period, which is not the base year period, nominal GDP and real GDP will never be the same. They're divided, they differ. So for example, in our example, don't waste time. If I ask you to calculate in this, we know 2022 has been designated as a base year period. So the real GDP, our GDP is going to have a notation for real GDP, is going to be the same thing as nominal GDP, as I say, in 2022, which is a base year period, in 2022, will be the same. And that number is $410,000. We calculate this earlier. So you don't waste time calculating a real GDP for a base year period if you already know the nominal GDP for that base year period, because the numbers are going to be the same. So, but real GDP for any other period, for like say 2023, you are going to take the quantity of cars in 2022, so 2023, but you're going to multiply it by the price in the base year period, the price of cars in 2022. See that? Because we're holding prices constant. We use 2022 price across the board. For any year that you calculate real GDP, you multiply the quantity in that year, you're calculating real GDP, but you don't multiply by the price in that year. You multiply it by the price of a base year period. And then you're going to add to it the quantity of computers in 2023, but you multiply it by the price of computers in the base year period, which is 2022. That is how we calculate real GDP. So in our example here, let me open a different slide and in a room. So your real GDP in 2023 is going to be the price of cars in 2022. 2022 price was $20,000. Go and check that example out again. Then you multiply that by the quantity of cars produced in 2023, which was 25, plus the price of the car, the price of computers in 2022, which was $1,000. A computer costs $1,000 in the base year period, but you're going to multiply this by the quantity in 2023, which was 15. So in this case, you're going to multiply it. So 20. So this is going to be, the first one is going to be $500,000 plus 15 times that, that's $15,000. So that means real GDP in 2023 is going to be the same thing as $515,000. Now, I want you to stay at this something here. Remember, nominal GDP for 2023, we found it to be 647,000. What is it? Was it? Let me go double check. Yes, it was 647,000. Okay, so 647. So why this huge difference? Because we have accounted, we held prices constant. That means if anytime real GDP increases, it is due to an increase in what? In the actual quantities of goods produced, because we are holding price constant across periods. But if nominal GDP goes up, it can be either that prices went up or and quantity go up as well, or a combination of the two. Let me repeat that again. When there's an increase in real GDP, it's not due to price change. It is due to an increase in the actual quantity of goods and services produced. But when there's an increase in nominal GDP, it can either be because of an increase in price or an increase in quantity or some combination of those two. Okay? Because real GDP is going to adjust for price level movement, making sure that what? If we control, we use constant year prices, or what we call base year prices, we are controlling for the effect of inflation or price changes on what? On the value of goods and services. So real GDP, such as real GDP, real variables, okay, so we talked about this already. So here's some example here. So increase in nominal GDP. So here we calculated, these are numbers already been calculated for you. Nominal GDP for 2018, nominal GDP for 2017. You see, when you're using nominal GDP, you multiply the price. You're calculating nominal GDP for 2018. You use 2018 prices times the quantity in 2018. Okay, so for this has already been, this like for the US economy, nominal GDP for 2018 was $20.6 trillion. And then nominal GDP for 2017, you take the price of that particular year, 2017 times the quantity. That's how what we say. So in this example, increase in nominal GDP, if I ask you to calculate the percentage increase in nominal GDP, which is a growth rate, you're just going to take the nominal GDP for 2018 minus nominal GDP for 2017, divide by nominal GDP for 2017 times 100. So that means nominal GDP increased or grew by 5.6%. Now let's look at real GDP. See, real, when I ask you, okay, so if we are using 2018 as our base year, that means to calculate real GDP for 2018, we're just going to multiply to 2018 price, because 2018 is a base price, base year price, so times the quantity produced in 2018. So you don't need to even, because in the base year period, remember nominal GDP and real GDP are the same. I told you that. See 20.6 and 20.6 here. But in other year, like 2017 is not a base year period. So we need to know that. If 2018 is a base year period, then real GDP of 2017 is going to be, you take the quantity of goods produced in 2017, but you don't multiply by 2017 prices. You multiply it by the base year price, and the base year happens to be 2018. So your real GDP is going to be 19.9. So you can see that In years which are not the base year period, nominal GDP and real GDP are always going to be different. But they will always be the same in the base year period. That goes back to my statement that I wrote earlier, that except for the base year period, nominal GDP and real GDP are not the same. So again, this is a little self-check for you. So real GDP is adjusted for changes in the price level. Yes, so that is a correct answer. That's what we're talking about. Real GDP adjusts for price level so that we get on an idea whether the country has made progress or an economy has made progress productively in how much we have produced. Okay. Okay. Now, let's talk about how we measure prices in the economy, in a macroeconomy. Remember, this is no longer microeconomics. So in macroeconomy, there's only one price that macroeconomists track. Because microeconomics, you're studying different firms. Maybe you're looking at the price charged by Amazon, by Apple on these products. So there are different prices in microeconomics because you're looking at different products. In macroeconomics, there's only one price. Okay, so let me talk about that. And that price, so let's say, let me talk. So I'm saying that in microeconomics, which we completed already, there are several prices. There are several prices on different goods and services that we produce, on different goods and services which we produce. The price of baby cereal is going to be different from the price of gasoline, a gallon of gasoline. The price of an Apple product like iPhone is going to be different from the price of an iPad. You know that. So that's microeconomics. There are different prices. In macro, there's only one price. So in macroeconomics, because we are talking about the economy as a one, in macroeconomics, there is only one price, which we call the general price level. And then in macro, also in macroeconomics, there's only one output. There's only one output, which we call GDP. We already talked about that. There's only one output. In microeconomics, you're looking at different outputs produced by different companies. When we aggregate all those outputs, get the market value of all of them, we are looking at one single number, GDP. So in macroeconomics, there's only one output at the economy-wide level. In microeconomics, there are several prices on different goods and services we produce. In macro, there's only one price. Now, the question is, how do we compute that one price in macroeconomics, which we call the general price level? So there are different ways of doing that. First of all, that when you think about when we say the general price level, that is kind of like saying it's almost like the average of all prices of goods and services. When we average the prices of all final goods and services, that is going to give us that average is going to give us that one price called the general price level. But there are different ways, methodologies of coming up with that one price. So one popular measure of that general price level is what we're going to be calling, how do we measure that one price? How do we measure the general price level in macroeconomics? So the first measure is what we're going to do, is what we call the GDP deflator. It's one way that macroeconomists measure the general price level. And the formula is very simple. The formula for the GDP deflator, so the GDP deflator is a price index that can be used to measure inflation. So it's the ratio of nominal GDP, this is nominal GDP, I don't know why my processor, to real GDP times 100. So you are to GDP deflator, or so which is going to be that GDP measure what? Price level in a macroeconomy. Because we say GDP deflator is a measure of price level. You just, if you know, like for example, if we know nominal GDP for 2024, and we know real GDP for 2024, we're just going to divide the numbers, the nominal GDP for 2024 divided by nominal GDP, real GDP for 2024 times 100. Simple. That would be the general price level for 2024. If we want to calculate the price level for 2023, we take nominal GDP for 2023 divided by real GDP in 2023 times 100. Simple. Yeah. Okay. So let's look at an example here. These are actual numbers for the United States. In 2016, nominal GDP was about $18.6 trillion, $18.57 trillion. And 2016 real GDP measured using 2009 dollars. So when I say 2019 real GDP measured in 2009 dollars, that means 2009 was used as the base year for calculating real GDP. That's right. So that means if 2009 was a base year, then real GDP for 2016 was $16.66 trillion. These numbers have already been calculated for you. So when I ask you to calculate GDP deflator, or the price level for the United States in 2026, you are going to take nominal GDP, which is $18.57 trillion, divided by real GDP, which is $16.66 trillion, times 100. That number comes to what? 111.46%. 111.46. Okay, now think about it for a second. I want to add one thing here. Because nominal, let me write this in short, nominal GDP and real GDP are the same in the base year period. So that means real GDP deflator, which is always where you take nominal GDP divide by real GDP. So in the base period, and our base period is 2009 times 100 here. So if nominal GDP is the same thing as real GDP in the base year period, you put a number there. If this was like, say, something like 12 trillion, and this is also 12 trillion, 12 trillion and 12 trillion cancel equals to 1. So that means in the base year period, 1 times 100 also is going to be 100. So don't waste time calculating the GDP deflator in a base year period. It's always 100. Period. Because in the base period, nominal and real GDP are always the same. So now that means because 2009 is a base year period, okay? That means in 2009, as the base year period, nominal GDP and real GDP are the same. It means the GDP deflator equals to 100. And we found that GDP deflator in 2016. GDP deflator was what? 101 point what? Is it point? I don't know what number we got there. Let's go back. 111.46. 111.46. Now that's very important. Now, we always like to compute inflation. Inflation is going to be defined as the percentage increase in the general price level from one period to the next. So define inflation here. Is the percentage increase in the general price level or in the GDP, because the GDP deflator is a measure of the price level. So it's just so inflation is going to be the percentage increase in the GDP deflator. GDP deflator in bracket general price level, because the GDP deflator measures general price level. From one period to the next. That's the definition of inflation, which you guys have been hearing on the news a lot. Oh, the economy has been wrecked by inflation in recent times. And that's true. You go to HEB, everything costs more. That's inflation right there. Okay. The opposite of inflation is what we call deflation. Deflation is the percentage decrease. Percentage decrease in the GDP deflator from one period to the next. And the formula for calculating inflation, you guys already know, percentage change. So for our example now, so we know that the GDP deflator in 2016 was 111.46. We did that. And then we said that in the base year period, GDP deflator in 2009 is 100. So inflation between 2009 and 2016 is going to be the percentage change in the GDP deflator. If that percentage change is positive, that is inflation. If it's negative, that means deflation. But looking at the numbers already, it's going to be positive. And you know, so inflation, you take the percentage increase in the GDP deflator. How do you calculate that? You got GDP deflator in 2016 minus GDP deflator in 2009. Okay. You divide that by GDP deflator in 2009. Then all these you multiply by 100. It has to be in percentage, which in our simple example is going to be, so that means inflation in 2016, between 2009 and 2016 is going to be 111.46. That was the GDP deflator in 2016 minus 100, the GDP deflator in 2009, divide by 100, the GDP deflator in 2009. So close this, close that. You multiply this by 100. So this is going to be equals to, when you see that, that's going to be, subtract 1 is going to be 11.46%. 11.46%. So that means prices, the general price level in between 2009 and 2016 went up by 11.46%. That's what we got. That's a measure of inflation. That's what he's saying. Okay. Okay, so let's talk about the real GDP growth per capita. So growth in real GDP per capita is usually the best reflection of changing living standards. We talked about that at the very beginning. So GDP per capita or GDP per person, remember, you take the total real GDP divided by the country's population. So the growth in real GDP does not account for changes in population. Okay? There can be large differences for countries with rapidly growing population. For example, I want to give you guys a very simple example here. There's always been that nervousness that China is catching up with the United States because China has been growing at a much faster rate. Okay? Even though the GDP, the real GDP for the United States is still higher than China. China is catching up. They're about to surpass the United States. American economy in 2023 produced goods about $25 trillion. China is right there about $20 trillion. Very, very close. Okay, so, but that doesn't mean that China, an average Chinese, okay, even if Chinese GDP were to catch up with that of the United States, it doesn't necessarily mean that the average living standard for an average Chinese will have caught up with the living standard of an average American. Why? Because remember, real GDP per capita, or per capita real GDP per capita, you're going to take real GDP divided by the population, country's population. So even if the real GDP on top here for the US and China were to equal, in China, you're going to be dividing that number by how many people live in China? 1.4 billion people. Because you're dividing that real GDP by a larger population. In the United States, how many people live here? Only 330 million Americans. That's the size of the US population, about from the latest census data. So so let me repeat that again. Average, the living standard or well-being of a country is measured by average income. Another average income is what we call real GDP per capita. So the formula is real GDP per capita divided by population. So even though the United States GDP were to be equal to Chinese GDP at some point in the near future, that doesn't necessarily translate to what the living standard for the two countries to be the same. No. Because in China, you have to divide that real GDP by a larger population. That will make this ratio smaller for China. Meanwhile, for the United States, it will be big. Okay. By the way, the average income in China, even though people say that the Chinese real GDP is catching up for the United States, the average income in China is still range between $10,000 to $13,000. That is not anywhere close to the United States average income of about $70,000. Even though the real GDP of these two economies might have almost equal, but average income is still so wide between China and the United States. It's a long way for China. So I want to make that point very clear. Okay, let's talk about cyclical and short-run changes. GDP is used to compare economic output across countries and over long periods. GDP is also used to measure short-run fluctuations in the economy. So according to the National Bureau of Economic Research, the NBER, by the way, this is the federal bureau that is in charge reporting to Americans when the recession has started and when it has ended. And we're going to talk about recession shortly. So a significant decline in economic activity spread across the economy lasting more than a few months, normally visible in real GDP, real income, employment, industrial production, and wholesale retail sales, is what we call a recession. That's the definition of a recession. In fact, the National Bureau of Economic Research always goes by like what? If GDP declines for 2 consecutive quarters in a year, those are 6 months. 2 consecutive quarters, 6-month decline of GDP, then that's the classic definition of a recession. Because when GDP is falling, when the economy is producing less and less output, what does that tell you? That means fewer and fewer Americans are at work. That's a sign of problem. So when the economy is in decline, where we're producing less and less output, that means companies are hiring fewer and fewer Americans. So unemployment number is going to go up. Employment is going to fall. Industrial production is going to fall. All sale and retail sales are going to what? They're going to fall. That's a classic definition of a recession. Recession is when GDP is falling, real income is falling, employment is falling, industrial production is falling, and wholesale retail sales are falling. And there are additional other characteristics of a recession as well. So a recession is a significant widespread decline in real GDP and employment. But other definitions, other features of a recession include the following. So during a recession, when the economy is in decline, we know that there's going to be high unemployment. High unemployment means lower employment. Because unemployment is the opposite of employment. So lower employment of labor. 2, investment declines. Investment always declines in a recession. People don't go shopping a lot because they don't have jobs. So consumption falls. Americans are, and then prices tend to fall during recession. Prices typically fall. If you survive your job during a terrible economy, during a recession, and you see you don't lose your job, the best time to go shopping is a recession. Because everything would be like 75% off. That's the best time to buy a car. That's the best time to buy a house. Home values tend to fall during recession because people don't have money. People who are selling homes can't find any buyers, so they are forced to lower the price. People who are selling stuff at the mall, they may be sitting in their shops for hours without seeing any customers. So to attract some customers, at least during a bad economy, to come buy their stuff, they need to lower the price. So prices typically fall during a recession. And then interest rates tend to fall as well in a recession. Those are some key characteristics of what a recession brings. Okay. So the US economy is a little bit volatile. I want to share with you this, what you see on the screen here. So if you can see very clearly, there are these very light green pole-looking, like is that bars, this pole-looking bars here you're seeing. Okay, so my data goes back to 1948. Those are the times when the US economy experienced economic recession. See? So you can see that during any pole-looking line, see, the economy tend to recede. You know, there's a GDP growth decline during recession, in any recession. And then in between, those two pole-looking bars, that's a period when the economy would be recovering, expanding, when the economy is growing again. Okay? So you can see that volatility in real GDP. That's what we call business cycle. Okay? So business cycle fluctuations, short-run movements in real GDP around this long-run trend. So a typical economy in a macro economy, let me draw a graph here. A typical business cycle looks like this. If we put real GDP growth on this axis, and then we put time on this axis, economy does not grow in a straight line. This is what we call the long-run trend. That would be nice if we grow in a straight line. Economy doesn't go like that. Instead, there volatility. The economy goes through up and down. These up and down swings is what we call business cycle. Okay? This is named business cycle for a reason. If you go up, that means the economy is growing. And then that growth doesn't continue forever. There's going to be a time when you stop growing. This is like the highest point you reach on these business cycles here. And the highest point you reach when you're growing is what we call a peak. Some people call it a boom. And then this side, this this period when you're growing, that's what we call expansion or recovery. Economy expanding. When the economy reaches peak, it's going to start declining, see? So the decline here is what we're calling recession. And then the recessions don't happen forever. You always hear economists like to say that, oh, we think the recession has bottomed up. That means they think that's the lowest point that the economy can recede before things start getting better. So the lowest point of a recession is what we call a trough. Then the economy again starts recovering. See, this go to another expansionary phase. Then it goes up to the peak. Again, we go to recession. You hit the bottom, another trough here. We recover again. That's how the economy grows. It's like the way I normally describe it to all my students is that the way the economy grows is similar to the way you drive on a road. If you're telling to drive from here to Denver, Colorado, you're never going to drive on a flat surface. Driving would be fun if you're driving on a flat road because you can see everything in front of you. It's not dangerous. But that's not how life is when you drive on the road. Sometimes you go down the hill and you're freaking out. That's a recession. Sometimes you climb the hill. It's a little bit fun like that. Okay? So these up and down swings, the up and down turns in economy is what we call business cycle. And that's how the economy grows. So a widespread decline in real GDP and employment is called, we just talked about that, that's recession. Recession is when GDP and employment is falling. If I said a widespread increase in real GDP and employment, that would be expansion or recovery, which is none of those things on order. This would have been the correct answer when I say the upturn and downturn is what we call business cycle. Upturns and downturns in the economy. Okay. So now let's talk about how we talked about how we measure real GDP and nominal GDP. Okay. But let's talk about how the economy split the production of goods, how we can actually, it's another way of capturing that GDP. So there are two common ways. If you want to know the total value of all goods and services produced in the economy, one way of knowing it is basically asking for how much we have spent on those goods and services. It will give you a clear idea what the value of goods and services are. Okay? So the first thing you ask because the idea here is that everyone's spending becomes somebody's income. So GDP measures two things. GDP is a measure of total spending on final goods and services in an economy in a given time period. It's also a measure of factor income, or the income that is earned by domestic factors of production. I'm going to break it down for you. So the first thing that we want to talk about here, let me open a slide here and kind of show you something here for a sec. So the way we split the GDP measurement is that we can say GDP measures two things. Actually, you could say measure three things, because one thing we already talked about. The first measure, GDP, is a measure of the value of production. We talked about that already. It's a measure of the value of production. And I want to make you understand this, my measure of the value of production. GDP is also a measure of total spending on goods and services. It's a measure of total spending or expenditure on goods and services. And then three, GDP is also a measure of income and by factors of production which are used in the production of that good. So we know the first one already, the measure of the value of production. When we say the economy has produced two goods, cars and computers. So we sum up the value of cars. That's a measure of the value of production, market value of production. Now, I want to do a simple Gora to make you understand why we're saying that the same number you get here is also a measure of what? Total spending on those goods. And it's also a measure of total income. I want to make it very clear so that when you go home, you clearly understand what we're talking about as macroeconomists. Okay? So think about it. Let's pretend. Let's say there was only one company in the United States. We know there are a million different companies that are producing different types of goods. But let's say that company, suppose there's only one company in the economy. Suppose there is only one company in the US. This is just for our example, because we don't want to use million different types of companies. We're not going to be able to do that on this small screen. We assume there's only one company in the US called Microsoft. So you guys know that Microsoft produces softwares. So let's say in 2023, Microsoft produced $10 billion worth of softwares, like the Microsoft Office and others. So that means because there's only one company in the economy, that means the value of Microsoft softwares that have been produced in 2023, which is $10 billion, would be the GDP. So that's GDP measuring the value of production. Okay? Now I want you to understand. Now the question is, when Microsoft produces its software, which is worth $10 billion, of course, there are different pieces of it. You ask yourself, who buys that software? Who buys Microsoft software? So these are the entities that buy Microsoft softwares. American households. American households are also called consumers. So if your family goes to Best Buy and picked up a Microsoft Office, buys a Microsoft Office to come and install in a computer that is used for home use, that is going to count as consumption expenditure by the household. If a business goes and buys the same software from Best Buy for business use to go and install in an office so that employees of that company can use Word and Excel, PowerPoint. Okay, so businesses can also purchase the same type of the same software. Then where does Microsoft, then even our government, if there's, like, say, the state of Texas or the city government, city of Austin or San Marcos goes and buy Microsoft Office to install in the what? For its city employees. That's going to be government spending, city government. It can also be purchased by federal government. Let's say the US Department of Defense goes and buys Microsoft software for DoD. That's going to count as government spending or government purchases. Okay, then I'm going to ask you one question. Does Microsoft sell its software to only American consumers, American business, American government? No. Microsoft software is used globally. So whatever remains, Microsoft is going to sell to foreign countries. Microsoft softwares are sold to Germany, to the UK, Africa, everywhere. Okay? So any Microsoft software that is sold to foreign countries, to foreigners, is what we're gonna call that exports. So exports is defined as foreign spending on US goods or on domestic goods. Because Microsoft is an American company. If it produces software, those are American goods. So if they sell some of those software to Mexico, to Japan, that's gonna what we call exports. But let me tell you, Microsoft is not the only company producing software. There's so many companies, even overseas. So if an American buys something which a software that is made in China or made in Germany, made in the United Kingdom, made in Canada or whatever, that does not count as part of US GDP. So we are going to minus what we call imports, because imports are not American goods. Imports, by definition, are domestic spending on foreign goods. So if you buy something labeled made in China, that does not count as US GDP. Because the definition of GDP is the total market value of all final goods and so on. Now, I want you guys to think about this. So let's go back here. So these are the only entities that are going to buy Microsoft product. So Microsoft, has produced goods worth $10 billion. That's what we say in 2023. So $10 billion count as a measure of the value of production. These are softwares. Then Microsoft is going to put those softwares in Best Buy, Walmart, everywhere, wherever, Amazon. And then American house consumers are going to purchase those softwares. So when they sell, so that $10 billion that you're seeing there, which is the value of Microsoft software is produced in 2023, is then going to be equivalent to the what? The amount of spending by consumers on those software, plus the amount of business spending on those softwares, the amount of government spending on those softwares, the amount of foreign spending on those software, which we call exports. But then we have to subtract a US spending on foreign goods, because those are not our goods. So that means GDP using the spending approach, then we can use this formula. We can break it down like this. To calculate GDP using the spending approach, you're going to sum up consumption spending or household spending. Then you're going to add to it business investment spending. And household consumer spending, we're going to notate that as C. Plus business spending, business investment spending. If you buy a Microsoft software for business use, for your home office, that is going to count as business investment spending, which we're going to be denoting as I, investment. Then plus government spending on Microsoft software. Government spending, we're going to notate it as G. And then we add to it foreign spending on goods, which you call exports. And then we're going to subtract from it imports, because imports are not our good. These are domestic spending on foreign goods. So that means the formula for GDP is going to be written like this. Using the spending approach, GDP then is going to be written as sum of consumer spending, which we denote as C, business investment spending, government spending, plus exports, minus imports. That's another way. So think about it for a second. Microsoft produced goods worth $10 billion in 2023. That's the value of production. And then those goods are sold to American consumers. So domestic or consumer spending on those software. Some of those softwares are sold to American businesses, what we call business investment spending. Some of those softwares are sold to government. Government can be both local, federal, local, state and local governments, like city government, county level governments. They're all going to be buying softwares. Plus foreign spending on Microsoft software. Foreign spending on US goods
is going to be what we call exports. We export those goods. Microsoft is going to export those goods abroad. But then we have to subtract any software that Americans or American government or American business purchase from overseas, because those are not our goods. So in fact, exports minus imports is what we call net exports. Then now you could now summarize this and say GDP using the spending approach is going to be the sum of consumer spending plus business investment spending plus government spending plus net exports. And the notation for net export is going to be what? NX. Just say NX here, net exports. That's the formula for GDP. You want to remember this formula at your fingertips. GDP equals to C plus I plus G plus NX. So that's what we're talking about here, GDP. And our notation for GDP, you can use Y for now to notate what? GDP. So it's Y equals, or you can write this, Y equals to C plus I plus G plus net exports. That's what I put here. Remember, these exports minus imports is what we're calling net exports. Okay, so now I broke it up. So then the other way of measuring you, now you ask yourself, remember Microsoft purchased what? Produced goods worth $10 billion. So if Microsoft sold all its software and earned $10 billion, where does that $10 billion go? Where does it go? So let me break it for you. So there's what we call factors of production in economics, or the means of production. Factor, the means of production. So these are inputs or factors that have helped Microsoft to produce goods. So in the production of software, what do we need? One factor of production, which is very critical for every company in the United States, is labor. Workers. Microsoft employs thousands and thousands of workers who are working in its factories, designing software, all kinds, engineers. The second factor of production, there are only 4 of them, is capital. Microsoft needs capital. Capital can be physical capital, which is the equipment, the machines, the factories, now that production plants that Microsoft has around the country. Or it could also be financial capital. Microsoft takes loans from banks or issues common stocks and bonds. It borrows money. And then the third factor of production that will help Microsoft produce software, people who have land, buildings, I'm going to lump them as one, or some kind of natural resources. They're going to lease these things to Microsoft. Microsoft can lease a building, can lease some land, lease some natural resources to produce this software. And then the last factor of production, which is critical to producing that software, is entrepreneurial ability. Entrepreneurial ability. Microsoft has got entrepreneurs. Like Bill Gates is behind Microsoft. He's the founder of Microsoft. Okay, so Bill Gates will get probably one of the biggest portion of the pie. Okay, so now let's put it this way. All these 4 entities have helped to produce that $10 billion of what? Of softwares. They must be rewarded. People who work for Microsoft don't work for free. Labor, if you're a worker, you get paid what? Wages. Or we can say employee compensation. Employee compensation is going to include things like what? The healthcare benefits you pay to workers at Microsoft, their wages, their paycheck that you give them every month, and other benefits. People who have supplied capital to Microsoft, like the banks that have given out loans to Microsoft, they're going to get paid interest payment. People who have leased their land, land, buildings, natural resources, whatever they've leased to Microsoft, they're going to collect rents. And then the owners of Microsoft are going to get on what? Profit. And by the way, people get misled. The profits, people who earn profit, it's not only Bill Gates and a few executives on Microsoft that are going to earn all the profit to Microsoft. Anytime you buy stock in Microsoft, you become a part owner of Microsoft. You're the shareholder. So let's say if Microsoft makes like maybe like say $5 billion in profit, that $5 billion gets shared among the shareholders, including the what? Bill Gates himself, who is the entrepreneur, who is the owner of the founder of the company. So that $10 billion, which is the value of software that Microsoft produced in 2023 and sold them to different entities that we talked about, which we call the spending way of breaking GDP, that $10 billion is going to be shared among these different what? Factors of production. Part of that $10 billion is going to be for employee compensation at Microsoft. Part of it is going to go to banks to pay interest payments on the loans that Microsoft might have taken from banks. Part of it is going to be going to pay rents of people who lease their land, buildings, or natural resources to Microsoft. And part of it is going to be paid to our entrepreneurs, what profit. So that means GDP can be calculated using the income approach. So GDP using the income approach. Remember our notation for GDP is now Y. The Y stands for what? Stands for GDP. So it's going to be, you're going to sum up what? Employee compensation. Because that's the income earned by employees at Microsoft. So employee compensation plus interest paid to capital owners like banks that have loaned money to Microsoft, interest, plus rents paid to people who have leased their land, their buildings, or their natural resources of Microsoft, and plus profit. That is another formula for GDP. So now you get to see that the $10 billion, which is the value of Microsoft production in what? Which counts as the value of production in 2023 for Microsoft, also count as income earned by domestic factors production, because that's how we're going to share that $10 billion worth of the software that they produce in 2023. We're going to distribute it in terms of employee compensation, interest payments, rents, and profits. And then the $10 billion can also count as total spending on those softwares. And the people who are spending on software include American households, also consumers, American businesses, what we call business investment spending, American government, both state, local, and federal, and entrepreneur who earn profit. So that's how we break out GDP. Okay, so you can see, so the factor income approach, you add up income generated by producing goods and services. So that GDP is going to be employee compensation, rent, interest, and profit. Okay. Okay, so this exactly basically summarize here. So when you're using the spending approach, the first approach there that we talked about, which is a national spending approach, you sum up nominal GDP, the market value of all finished goods and services. So for Microsoft, consumers are going to spend. C stands for private spending on finished goods and services. Investment, I stands for private spending on tools, plant, and equipment used to produce future goods. Government, or it could be also like loans, because you get paid interest rate. And then, investment spending generally. You're buying, you spend money on Microsoft to software for your business purposes. And then government purchases. Government also buys those softwares. Okay, transfers, what we call transfer payments, they are not included in government purchases. Let me break this down. So there are two types of government spending out there. One of them is what we call transfer payments. Transfer payments are basically include things like social security benefits that the government send to seniors, Medicare and Medicaid benefits, unemployment insurance benefits. If somebody loses a job, they go and apply for unemployment insurance, welfare. Those types of payments do not result into direct production of goods and services. Let me be clear. So transfer payments, such as social security benefits sent to seniors, Medicare and Medicaid benefits, and unemployment insurance benefits sent to Americans who have lost their jobs, do not count as government spending. Government spending are going to be spending on things like the military, building roads, highways, bridges, national defense, etc. But transfer payments are not part of government purchase or government spending. And then net export, as I told you, which is NX, is the net value of exports minus the value of imports. Okay. So let's look at some numbers here. These are the long-term averages from 1950 to 2018. So the economy, these goods are in trillions of dollars. The economy produces goods like, a lot of it, maybe close to $20 trillion. But you can see about 15 trillion of those whatever, which is about, $13.99 trillion count as consumer spending. Okay? So consumer spending is the largest component of GDP. In fact, when you hear somebody making a statement that that American economy is a consumer-based economy, that's what they're basically talking about. We eat about 70% of the economy, of what we produce, count as consumption. Okay? And then investment will account for about 17.4% or about $3.62 trillion. Government purchases or government spending account for $3.5 trillion, 5.9. When I say government purchases spending here, that includes both federal, state, and local government spending. Most spending actually happens at the state and local government levels. And then net export, America has always been a deficit count when it comes to trade. In other words, our imports, we always import more goods from abroad than we sell abroad. Because net export is exports minus imports. So, remember net exports is exports minus imports. So if your import is always larger than your export, this number is going to be negative. That's why this is negative 3.0 or a negative 0.63 trillion dollars. Okay. So if I ask you to calculate GDP using a spending approach here, you're just going to add, because remember GDPY is C plus I plus G plus net exports. So your GDP would be consumer spending is 13.99. These numbers in trillions of dollars, plus investment spending, which is going to be $3.62 trillion, plus government spending, which is what? $3.59 trillion. Then plus net export, which is negative $0.63 trillion. So if you use your calculator, just sum all that. That would be your GDP average between 1950 and 2018. The factor income approach, we say we just GDP, you take our employee compensation, rent, interest, and profit. When a consumer spends money, the money is received by workers, landlords, owners of capital, and businesses. We can therefore calculate GDP by adding up all the incomes received by different factors of production. We call that the factor income approach to calculating GDP, or the income approach for short. So check your understanding here, self-check. Which of the following splits GDP according to the national spending approach? Of course, the answer is A. The sum of the total spending by consumers. C, business investment. We just talked about this. Okay. If I ask you the income approach, it will be this one here, but it is talking about the national spending approach. So A is a correct choice. So the last thing I want to talk about, what are the problems of using GDP as a measure of output or using GDP as a measure of welfare? The first problem is that illegal or underground market transactions are omitted from GDP, and that can sometimes be huge. If some people are trading illicit drugs, like illegal drugs, okay, employing workers illegally. Because we have a lot of, undocumented workers who work in this country. They're being employed illegally. Because they're being employed illegally, nobody knows how much they earn because they're being paid under the table. There are companies that take advantage of undocumented workers. So that is going to be a limitation of GDP. Maybe the GDP numbers could actually be more if we include incomes earned by illegal or undocumented workers, or income earned by people who are trading illegal, doing illegal activities like drugs and other things. But because there's no way we can quantify what is being traded illegally or workers who are being paid illegally because they're undocumented, that is going to make the numbers that we calculate that the government give to us be a little bit, it's going to be like a little bit like underrated. Okay. In the United States or Western Europe, the size of the underground economy or illegal activities ranges between 10 to 20% of GDP. Those are things. I remember illegal activities. These people may not be paying taxes. People who are trading drugs illegally don't pay taxes on that, or you know that. So government actually losing revenue. In developing countries or poorer countries, the size of underground economy could go as high as 40 to 50%. That is real. That's how bad it is in developing countries. Okay, like in Latin America, for example, the informal sector, that's underground economy, is estimated to be about 41% of the officially measured GDP. So that means the government is losing revenue on 40% of income earned in that sector, which we call underground economy in Latin America. And then the other thing is GDP does not count non-price production when valued goods and services are produced but no monetary payment is made. For example, doing household work, reading free blogs, volunteering are not going to be counted under GDP. If I wake up in the morning and make breakfast for my family, make dinner, make lunch, I'm working at home. So production at home is not going to be counted as GDP. Okay? But if I hire a nanny who comes and cleans my house and cooks us food and we pay the nanny, that is going to count as GDP because they're earning income. That's going to be part of employee compensation. But if I cook dinner as a husband or my wife cooks dinner for the family, what you call, household activities, that is not going to count as GDP. And then also, if you go to developing countries, the size of what they call subsistence living is very high. There are people who own land, they grow their own food crops, they raise their own livestock, and they feed themselves using the what? The simple crop farming that they're doing at home. They just go to their garden and pick up tomatoes. So we don't quantify the market value of subsistence living. It has to be a market, something that is taken to the market for sale. So that is going to underscore the numbers we calculate as GDP. Those are some of the limitations of using GDP. So this introduces two biases to GDP statistics: biases over time and biases across nations. As more women in the United States entered the workforce, households shifted from unpaid to paid. Women's participation in the workforce varies across countries, underestimating the proportion of work included in GDP. So that's another thing. And then GDP adds up the value of finished goods and services, but does not subtract the value of bags. What do I mean by value of bags? We don't care. Okay, America is the largest economy producing goods worth $25 trillion. That's a good thing. But we don't account for that production might be damaging the environment. We don't account for the cost of pollution or environmental degradation as a result of mass production. That's not going to be included in GDP. So that is going to be that's going to be a limitation of using GDP as a measure of welfare. Because if we are producing a lot of goods and services by building production plants all over the country, we are going to be polluting the environment. And the cost of pollution is not going to be accounted for in that GDP number. And then the GDP, there's going to be changing supplies of natural resource goods because we're exploiting all the natural resource goods, oil, copper, zinc, cobalt, whatever you're mining out there. And then loss of animal or plant species. GDP does not account for crime. I talked about it earlier. It just tells us the economy has produced a lot of goods and services, but what about if the crime rate is high? We don't include that in GDP, account for that in GDP. But crime, high crimes across our cities affect our welfare. So this is like the idea of saying that GDP numbers have limitation when we're using it as a measure of welfare. Green accounting attempts to cover the environment more explicitly. Environmental amenities are difficult to measure. Okay. And then GDP also does not count the health of nations. That's right. To allocate resources, we must put numbers on the value of health. Between 2007 and 2014, life expectancy increased in the United States by about 1 year. The average life expectancy in America is about 79 to 8. I think it is reduced to 79 due to COVID. Life expectancy is the number of years you expected to live from birth to death. On average, Americans live up to the age of about 80 years. And this varies across countries. You go to African countries, the life expectancy is only 50 years. But when you go back to you go back in time, in let's say 60 years ago or 100 years ago, life expectancy used to be very low in America as well. An average American used to live and die before reaching the age of 60, some 50 years ago. But that has been improving over time as the economy grew. Economists have estimated that people value an additional year of life at about $150,000. An extra year of life valued $150,000 for 300 million people is worth $44.5 trillion. But that's not something we capture in GDP. We don't capture the value of an additional year of life. So here are the takeaways. These are just summaries of what I've talked about. I talked about GDP as an estimate of the economic output of a nation over a year. I talk about GDP can be summed up in different ways. You can use the national spending identity, or you can use the factor income approach. And then I talk about GDP per capita is a rough estimate of the standard of living. There are other things that we talked about in between. For example, distinction between nominal and real GDP. We talked about that. Okay. So this concludes my discussion of chapter 26. I'm going to be covering now more chapters on macroeconomic topics. So expect a quiz or homework to be assigned based on this chapter, maybe tomorrow or tomorrow next. I'll convert this recording into a permanent YouTube link that will be shared with you at Canvas. Thank you very much. I'll talk to you guys next time. Bye-bye.